Be honest, are you faking it in the bedroom? If you are not alone. Studies show that up to 70% of women have faked an orgasm at least once. But here's the real question. Why do we fake it and at what cost? From the societal pressures to perform, to the orgasm gap, to myths about what sex should look like, the reasons are complex. And in midlife, as our bodies, hormones, and desires change, it can feel even harder to prioritize our own pleasure. Get ready for an enlightening conversation that will challenge myths, inspire confidence, and provide practical tools for embracing your pleasure in midlife and beyond. Welcome to Pleasure in the Pause, a podcast dedicated to inspiring midlife women to connect to their bodies, pleasure, and power through perimenopause, menopause, and beyond. I am your host, Gabriella Espinosa, women's health and sexual wellness coach, and it is my pleasure to be here with you. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Laurie Mintz, a trailblazing psychologist, professor of human sexuality, and author of the groundbreaking book, Becoming Cliterate: Why Orgasm Equality Matters and How to Get It. With over 30 years of experience, Dr. Mintz has dedicated her career to empowering women to understand their bodies, close the orgasm gap, and reclaim their pleasure. Her TEDx talk has been viewed over 2 million times, and she's been recognized by Forbes as one of their 50 over 50 innovators. Let's dive in as Dr. Mintz shares her expertise, research, and practical advice to help us rewrite the narrative around women's sexual satisfaction. Welcome, Dr. Mintz.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Thank you so much for all the work you've done to elevate the conversation around sexual pleasure. I've been following you for a while. You have a career span of 30 years as a sex educator, professor of human sexuality, therapist, speaker, author. I love the way you use language that's fun, empowering, and accessible. And I'd love for you to start by sharing with our listeners how you landed in this beautiful space of human sexuality, specifically your fascination with the clitoris, which we'll get into in our conversation. And were you always as comfortable talking about female pleasure?
Yes, which is unusual. I know. I was raised by a very unusually sex positive mother, way ahead of her time. There's a story I love to tell, and then I'll tell you how I got into this. When I was like 7 or 8, I knocked on the bathroom door. She was taking her bath, and we were never supposed to interrupt this private time, this pleasurable time for her. And I know we're going to talk about pleasure. And I said, I have to talk to you. And she said, what's so important that you're interrupting my bath? And I said, I've been touching myself down there. And she said, oh my gosh, that's not important enough to interrupt my bath for. Everybody does that. Go away. Just make sure your door's closed when you do it. So very, very unusually sex positive. And then I was a licensed psychologist for many years. And I specialized in eating disorders and body image. And sex wasn't really on my radar as something to delve into. And then maybe about 10 years into my career, all my clients, all my friends, myself, everybody started saying, I've lost my sex drive. And I thought, why didn't they ever train me on this in grad school? And then I did a deep dive into the literature and found there were clinical solutions that I'd never been trained on. And I thought women need to know this. So I wrote my first book, A Tired Woman's Guide to Passionate Sex. And then that kind of set me into the sexual health field, which, I got more and more speaking opportunities, et cetera. And then I got the honor of teaching an undergrad human sexuality class to hundreds of students. And it was in that class that I realized my students were not having orgasms. They'd not even ever heard of the clitoris. And this was like 2015. I was like, what happened here? This whole knowledge has been lost. And so I started teaching the class to female orgasm, to pleasure. And I would get beautiful notes from my women students. Thanks to your class, I'm orgasmic. Male students, thanks to your class, my girlfriend's orgasmic. And I thought, I am writing a book about Becoming Cliterate, about female pleasure.
Oh, I love that. And yes, so much about what you say around the loss of desire is something I hear over and over again in the midlife and menopause space. It's really one of the most prevalent myths in midlife that once we hit midlife or once we hit menopause, that our sexual pleasure is over. But please tell us that's not true.
It's absolutely not true. In fact, there was a study by a woman who's wonderful named Peggy Kleinpetz,
Mm.
and she wrote a book called Magnificent Sex. She decided, I'm not going to study people who are having sexual problems. I'm going to study people who are having great sex. And what she found is that the best sex started at age 50.
Oh, yes.
And the reason is,
Uh-huh.
right, we know our bodies, we get more comfortable with our bodies, saying what we want, and we get more creative. Sex is not just something you do when you're horny. You carve out time for it. You don't revolve the whole thing around penetration. So, in fact, menopause, midlife does not signal the end of sex. It can signal with the right attitudes, the right skills, and in fact, often the right hormone treatment, it can mean the best sex of your life.
I love that message. And we're going to unpack a lot of what you said about how to have magnificent sex in midlife today. I wanted to talk to you about going into this topic of hormone treatments. I talked to some amazing doctors here on the podcast, Dr. Rachel Rubin, Dr. Maria Sophocles, Dr. Maria Uloco, who have all spoken about how the hormonal changes of menopause lead to not only a decline in sexual desire, but changes to our vulvovaginal anatomy that makes it painful and distressing to even think about sexual pleasure. So a lot of, midlife women start to turn away from pleasure time and time again. They don't know how to turn towards it, after going through this period of such discomfort and such distress. How can midlife women navigate these changes and still enjoy fulfilling, pleasurable sex lives? Because the changes are real. They are happening in real time, but that doesn't mean we have to say goodbye.
No. And you've had I am not a physician, so I can't speak Dr. Rubin and the others. I can't give medical advice, but I can tell you what I've learned going to medical conferences and personally. So sex is a biological, psychological, and social event. So the biology piece is the hormones. The loss of estrogen during menopause, it has a number of effects, as I'm sure Dr. Rubin and others have talked about. It makes the vaginal tissue thin, which can make your vulva hurt, your vagina hurt, penetration hurt, touch hurt, can lead to UTIs, all of that. And so, that old study that said it's dangerous is really hurt women. Women need estrogen. As my doctor said to me, we have outlived our uteruses. We used to die before this happened. It's kind of like people saying, oh, I don't want that, is like somebody who loses their hearing saying, I don't want a hearing aid. We have to treat what happens in our bodies with the loss of estrogen. And that can be done vaginally, systemically, both. I can tell you personally, I can't speak as a physician, but I am on systemic estrogen and progesterone because if you have a uterus, you need both. I'm on testosterone off label. Menopause hit me hard. I have to do both the systemic and the vaginally inserted estrogen. So the bottom line is that biological piece. So what do women need to do? They need to go to a certified menopause physician through NAMS, National American Menopause Society, or a sexual medicine physician through the International Society of the Study of Women's Sexual Health. There's Find a Provider link on those sites because too many gynecologists are still stuck back. Oh, that's harmful. And the people like Rachel Rubin, who've been instrumental in bringing this to the world, are the ones who are trained to help women get the right medicine. And that's the baseline. Then, of course, is the relationship, the touch, the pleasure, the what you're doing with your mind. That's my piece of it.
Yes, and I'd love to go into that. And thank you so much for sharing your experience. I think it always helps to hear experts like yourself who talk so much about pleasure and orgasms to say, it's okay to turn to medical modalities as well, right? We need all the help we can get, and we need to keep our tissues thriving and healthy so that we can keep having that magnificent sex well into the second half of our lives. Your book, Becoming Cliterate, which I love, I recommend it. It's at the top of my reading list. Here it is.
Thank you.
You write about the social, the psychological, right? Especially the social and cultural narratives we've inherited about what sex should look like, right? It's performative. It's always about penetration. It should be hot and heavy. We should all come together in total bliss, but it doesn't really feel or work that way in our midlife bodies. So we can feel broken or worse yet. And you give some astounding statistics. 70% of women report faking their orgasms to pleasure their partners or not disappoint their partners. And this just becomes on repeat. This is what we're conditioned to do. How can we begin to close that gap and reclaim our sexual pleasure for ourselves?
For the vast majority of women, it is about external stimulation and considering that as essential as penetration. If you look at movies, porn, if women orgasm at all, they orgasm from penetration. I've had so many women say, "What's wrong with me? Why can't I do that? I'm broken." When in fact, the research is so clear, depending how the study is worded, only 4 to 18% of women orgasm from penetration alone. The rest need external stimulation, either alone or coupled with penetration. Here's a statistic that I think says it all. When women masturbate, less than 2% do so by putting something in their vagina. Less than 2%. The rest use external stimulation, either alone or coupled with penetration, and mostly alone. And yet, when what we're fed is these images of fast and fabulous orgasms from penetration alone. And that is not going to bring most women orgasm. And in fact, for many women, it's painful. Why? It could be due to menopause, or in younger women are having pain at alarming rates. Why? Because they have penetration before they're even aroused, or don't use lube, or both. So to have pleasure, it's this most essential but underutilized advice. Get the same type of stimulation with a partner as you do alone. This is not women's bodies. Women know their bodies when alone. It's just when a man enters the equation, they say, "Oh, maybe, I can do it a different way."
Yeah. Okay. So much that I want to unpack there. You mentioned, the moment penetration happens, that can be very painful. Dr. Rachel Rubin, along with some of the other doctors that have been here on the podcast, have stated, right, that vestibule area, that entrance to the vagina, that's the area that is usually most sensitive and most impacted by the loss of estrogen. And that's where we're going to experience pain. So, and you're talking about not even going there. You're talking about external stimulation. Your book, you start by looking literally under the clitoral hood. Very early on, you have a super informative chapter on vulval and clitoral anatomy, and you compare it to male sexual anatomy because the clitoris and the penis are both analogous, something that I think many of us aren't even aware of. I had the wonderful Sherry Winston who walked us through the buried pleasure of our sexual anatomy. And I love that you make this the focus of so much of your teaching and advocacy. I don't think we can emphasize it enough. You emphasize that clitoral stimulation is key to orgasm for most women, yet it's often overlooked in favor of penetration-focused sex. But for many midlife women, especially it was my experience as I moved into midlife, and many of the women that I work with, this is something we never learned, right? We were never taught this. And so how can we start shifting our perspective and incorporate more clitoral stimulation into our sexual experiences? How and where do we start?
Well, first, it starts with the attitude, knowing you deserve sexual pleasure and being able to turn off your self-monitoring during a sexual encounter. Is he having fun? Is this taking too long, right? Then it starts with self-pleasure. Pleasure yourself. Use lube. Use a vibrator. Focus on the outside. Bring yourself to orgasm. Get comfortable with that. And then it's communication with a partner, explaining to a partner outside the bedroom that you need that you want that. And I can give scripts even for doing that. Then really changing this script of foreplay. I hate these words. If we examine them, right? Foreplay, what comes before, just to get her ready for intercourse, making that a prelude to the main event. Intercourse, which we call sex in our culture, as if that is the only and main act during which a woman is supposed to orgasm. We have to change that, the language and the way we do it. No more foreplay. That's the main play, as much as penetration is, considering that as much the main act. And switching out the scripts. No more trying to come at the same time. She Comes First. That's a great book by Ian Kerner about orgasming through oral sex, but it can be different. It can be vibrator stimulation, hands. Take turns. We know lesbian women have more orgasms, and it's because they take turns receiving and giving pleasure rather than both expecting to orgasm at the same act. And also, really important, I want every woman listening to hear this. It is no less sex if you touch yourself. You can use a vibrator on yourself while your partner caresses your breasts. You can use a vibrator on yourself while you're giving oral sex. You can use a vibrator on yourself during intercourse. You can use one after. You know what you feel. And the whole act, it just privileges male sexuality if it revolves around the penis. So it's completely legitimate, just as much sex to touch yourself and have your partner be part of the action.
Thank you so much for that. There are a couple of things that came up for me when I heard you speak. Yes, the touching yourself, something maybe some of us were told we shouldn't do, that, good girls don't do that. And so sometimes we move into midlife never having engaged in self-touch or self-pleasure. I know there's this term, genital self-esteem. Some of us have low genital self-esteem. We hold negative thoughts about our vulvas, our clitorises, because of not only language that we hear out in culture, perhaps because of the pain that they sometimes give us, or because of the loss of sensation that we suddenly experience. How can we move into a more compassionate and loving relationship with our vulvas?
Well, first of all, take a look. And many of us haven't, but it is the first step to loving your vulva. And all vulvas are beautiful. We're just not used to seeing them. They all are different. Many women, including myself, have an inner lip that sticks out from the outer lip. That's how my vulva looks. It's just how it looks, and it's beautiful. And really, I always, when I'm working with a woman who hasn't orgasmed, my first step is educating her on clitoral anatomy and vulva anatomy, like I do in my book. My second step is sending her home with a diagram and telling her, take a mirror and examine all your parts. And I know Dr. Rubin talks about this. It was very powerful when I heard her say this. When you go to the gynecologist's office and they put a drape over you so you can't see? If you go because your elbow hurts, they don't drape the elbow for privacy. So some gynecologists are now having these mirrors where you watch the exam and they show you your parts. And it's these messages are so insidious that we're dirty, that we look bad, we smell bad. I mean, all these things like washes, scented pads, they're all bad for us. So really knowing your vulva is beautiful. It's a self-cleaning oven. You don't need to douche or use scented stuff. And so having that attitude, seeing what's there, and then buy some lube, buy a vibrator, take the time, enjoy yourself, pleasure yourself.
And when we talked about earlier about the similarities between the penis and the clitoris, the female erectile network, I learned this word the other day, clitoral tumescence, which I love that word. It's so beautiful. I'm like, oh my gosh, if I knew that word applied to my clitoris, I would have like started a long time ago. I heard that it basically means the erection, right? The full arousal of the clitoris. And so allowing ourselves to know that takes time, right? I hear all the time, it takes me so much time. And I think that's why we forfeit our orgasm to our partners, because it's taking me too much time. What do we do when it takes too much time? Or how much time should we be spending in stimulating our clitorises so that we get into that tumescent state?
Yeah. And I love that you explain that. And I guess to add on to that, the head of the clitoris, the glans, is equivalent to the head of the penis. The clitoral hood is equivalent to the foreskin. Like there's an internal part of it. It's all equivalent to the penis. And like the penis, it gets erect. It has erectile tissue. And there was a most fascinating study where they had women and men say what an orgasm felt like. Then they took away anything that could identify, is this a woman writing, a man? They gave it to physicians and sex therapists, and no one could tell the difference. Everybody described a buildup of pleasure and a release of that pleasure. Mm-hmm. So we have erections, we have orgasms the same way penises do. And how long does it take? As long as it takes. Take all the time you need. And it's going to take longer with a partner than alone. Alone, it can be very quick. Average is about 4 minutes. Why? Because we're not in our heads going, is this taking too long? Is he having fun? How do I look? Should I suck my stomach in? Do I smell okay? All those, you can't have an orgasm when you're focused like that. You have to focus on your bodily sensations. And the best way to learn to do that is first outside of the bedroom, yoga, meditation. The next time you're brushing your teeth, really focus on the sensations. When your mind wanders, bring it back. Then practice that alone, mindfulness, then with a partner. Because the greatest irony of partner sex is there is a moment, if you orgasm and your partner orgasms, where you're not focused on your partner. To orgasm requires a complete focus on oneself. And you have to learn to do that intense self-body focus.
And practices like mindfulness. I've heard you say you're a yoga practitioner on another podcast that I listened to, and you find that really helps cultivate that internal awareness of bodily sensation. I know there's research. I had Laurie Mintz on the podcast where she took women through an 8-week mindfulness course, and they were able to feel that desire because they were tuning into their bodily sensations instead of shutting them out, instead of saying, no, it's too much. That's another thing I hear from women. I'm too much because I'm asking too much of my partner because I want to be touched here, there, and everywhere. And it takes more time. And another thing I'd love for you to talk about is that women, as opposed to men, can be multi-orgasmic in one session, right? So that's where I'm too much. Whereas you can have these beautiful waves of pleasure and orgasm that continue over and over again. Whereas for men, it can just be a one and done. And then it takes them, there's a little, is it called a refractory period?
Yes.
Could you explain that for us, please?
Yeah. So when men orgasm, And there are some men who are multi-orgasmic, but can we put that on the shelf because it's so
Yes.
rare? Okay. The overwhelming majority of men cannot have another ejaculation and orgasm when they've had one. It's called the refractory period. It's actually due to a chemical called prolactin that gets secreted when men orgasm. Not so for women. We call them multiple orgasms in the popular press, but what they are really in general are sequential orgasms, having one after the other. Now, some women don't want that. They're like, one and done. I'm good. I'm going to sleep. I'm going to cuddle. I'm done. Other women, right after they orgasm, if the stimulation continues, and often not in the exact same way, because that can be painful, like it kind of restarts a bit before you've come all the way down, you can have another and another.
Amazing.
Yeah, our bodies are amazing.
We can have more, right? We can have more. It's not selfish or indulgent. We can have more. And I often find, just it's okay if I share my personal experience, when I was able to guide my husband. We've been married for 23 years, and it wasn't until midlife that I guided him into my own clitoral anatomy, my own anatomy. And he was just so grateful and just in awe. He had no idea, right? Because we had been doing things the way movies, porn. And back then, 23 years ago, it was easy just to get it quick and done, right? It was much, much easier. But, as we got older, things took longer and took more time and would be frustrating for me. And I would forfeit my pleasure. And I would just literally say, okay, go ahead and have yours. I love you. Go ahead and have yours. I wouldn't fake it, but I would just say, go ahead and have yours. And it just would leave me feeling frustrated and broken and, just thinking, yeah, I don't know. Is it because I'm old? Is it because it's over? But once I started getting to know, thankfully, to books like yours and getting to experiment through self-pleasure and then being able to guide my partner, he was so thankful. He was just like, gosh, why didn't we know this? Why don't we know this? So I think whereas some of us may feel it's selfish or indulgent or we're taking too much time, our partners are totally in the dark as well. And I think they would feel so grateful as well to learn this, to take the time to learn this.
Absolutely. I have counseled many men, taught many students, and sure, there's a few men who don't care about women's pleasure. If you find one, run. However, the overwhelming majority of men care a lot. In fact, research shows men's self-esteem is tied to their partner orgasming. But these poor men, as well as these poor women, and we can change this, have been misguided to think their penis is essential and they have to last long and thrust hard. And in fact, once men discover that women can be brought to orgasm with their hands, their tongue, the woman's hand, a vibrator, sex gets better for them too, because it takes the pressure off of them. And then we can do that turn-taking thing where both partners are fully immersed in their own pleasure.
So beautiful. And going back to this idea of the multi-orgasmic woman, not that we always have to go there, a one and done is good too. Why do we want to experience orgasms besides it feeling really good?
Okay, it feels good, first of all.
Yeah.
It feels great. Second of all, we know it's healthy. It helps our stress reduction. It helps our vaginal health. It helps our heart health. It helps our skin health. And there was a study that just came out that reviewed all these studies on orgasm in women, and they found that it is not frivolous. Orgasm is related to sexual satisfaction. Now, many women say, oh, I'm happy without. But when they really look at the data, women are more satisfied when they orgasm. And sexual satisfaction is correlated very highly with relationship satisfaction. And get this, life satisfaction. So why are orgasms important? Because you'll be happier with your relationship and your life.
I've also recently heard there are statistics on longevity measures. I think they've been done on men, but I don't know if they've been done on women. But I
No,
mean,
but they have been done on men yet. Yes. And I don't have any reason to believe it would be different in women.
so we get to live longer.
And we'll be happier while we're alive.
And so going back to like, how do we even get there? Many women going through perimenopause and menopause report a decrease in their desire, right? And I think you talk about responsive desire as opposed to this spontaneous desire that we feel we've been conditioned to think we should experience all the time on demand. When I learned this concept of responsive desire, it was so liberating. It just validated my experience because I went from feeling that hot and sexy, fiery, spontaneous desire when I was courting with my husband to then having 3 kids straight in a row in the depths of motherhood, trying to have a career. And yeah, it all went south after that. And I had no idea what had happened. Can you talk to us about the concept of responsive desire and how it applies not only to motherhood, but to midlife women who may feel disconnected from their sexual selves?
Absolutely. And this is why I wrote my first book, A Tired Woman's Guide to Passionate Sex. And it's a lot about responsive desire. So there's 2 types of desire. I'm horny, which is actually really the beginning of arousal. It's a biological thing. Your vagina lubricates or throbs or whatever. It's a physical thing. We're horny. And it might be because we see a handsome partner, or we're in the presence of a new partner, we're dating, whatever it is. And over time, as we age and as relationships age, we stop feeling that. It just goes away, and that's normal. But people don't know that. And they say, oh, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with my relationship? And they don't know that there's a second type of desire, responsive desire. And what it is I'm open to the idea of sex in my mind, right? Because I know it'll be good when it gets going. I know I'll sleep better. I know I'll feel closer to my partner. There's lots of reasons to want sex. And in fact, side note, they did a study of reasons people have sex. And being horny wasn't number 1, it was number 5. So there's lots of reasons people have sex. And responsive desire is you have sex because you're interested in your mind without being horny. What happens is the touch itself leads you to being horny. We've learned this horny, sex, fun. And it can be, interest, touch, horny. So I tell people, reverse the equation, have sex to get horny rather than waiting to be horny to have sex.
So the desire can come afterwards.
Yes. And that's why it's a scientifically supported technique to say to women and couples, figure out your ideal frequency and then set aside the time, have a sexual encounter. Let the encounter lead you to the desire. The other metaphor I give, here we are on this podcast together. We didn't just spontaneously show up on your platform at the same time. We planned it. We both carved out time for it because we both considered it important. And the same has to happen in busy lives for sexual encounters.
So you're an advocate of scheduling, planning.
Yes, especially for women who say they've lost their desire, because if they're waiting to be horny, they'll never have a sexual encounter. And then that tension, are we going to do it tonight? Are we not? Do you want to? Do I not want to? Having it in the calendar takes that away.
And communication, like negotiating when you do that and how you do that and what's going to happen during that time that you've scheduled involves communication. I've heard you say several times that communication is the bedrock to make your bed rock.
Yes, I do say that. That comes from a client of mine. And I said, I love that. Can I use it? Yeah, it's so true.
So how do we begin to negotiate, bring up these conversations of what's actually going to happen in that time and space that we've scheduled for each other?
It starts with a conversation out of the bedroom. And you use meta communication, which is communication about communication, and then I statements. So here's an example. I want to talk to you about something about our sex life. I'm really afraid. I'm afraid you're going to get defensive. I don't want you to do that. I want us to have a good discussion because I want this discussion because I love you and I want our sex life to be the best it can be. Are you open to talking about that? Okay, good. I'm so glad. I listened to this podcast today, and the host and the guest were talking about how in busy lives, it really works to decide our ideal frequency and then to carve out time and to have a sexual encounter and really take the time. That can be like, then you can get into more details, but just to really bring that up. And it's scientifically supported. And if that conversation doesn't go well, suggest going to a certified sex therapist who will no doubt suggest that.
Wonderful. I love that. And especially for couples in long-term relationships, right? Maybe we've gotten used to doing things a certain way and okay, we schedule that time and then what we go, how do we break out of like the routine habit that we've been used to? And really, I don't like to use this word, but yeah, how do we aim for a pleasurable, not necessarily successful? I don't know, you can measure success in whatever way you want, but how can we create a pleasurable environment for that time we carve out for each other, even if it means that perhaps you're not going to have the orgasm, but it is a time for coming together and learning and exploring and being curious and just having fun and being playful. How do we get out of the routine habit of what we used to do and what used to work but no longer works, especially in long-term relationships?
Those are conversations outside of the bedroom too. I'm interested in trying something new. I'm interested in trying to use my vibrator on myself while you touch my breasts, or, I'm interested in trying this. I'm interested in trying that. The most important thing is conversations outside of the bedroom. And if that's too uncomfortable, again, a sex therapist can help with that. Communication is essential. And the research is so clear that couples who talk about sex outside of the bedroom, who communicate, and communicating during sex. Ooh, that hurts. Ooh, that doesn't feel good. Ooh, right there. Talking about it, reading books together, watching. There's a great site called omgyes.com that, watching that together, reading books together, reading educational material about sex together can be fantastic.
Because we're not too old to learn Nitrex.
Never too old. One of the things I love about being a sex educator and therapist, I learn something new every day. Like there's still so much to learn. And here I am, an expert on the topic. I learn something new every day.
You mentioned earlier you used to deal with eating disorders, body image issues. I know many women struggle with body image or not feeling confident, sexually confident because of the changes that their bodies are going through. What advice do you have for midlife women wanting to overcome these barriers to feel more confident and empowered in their sexual lives?
Mindfulness, yoga, being in your body, loving your body for what it's capable of doing rather than how it looks. Loving all parts of your body, but for the function. It's so hard for women, and I empathize so much. I really do. I had serious body image issues in college. I mean, I never had an orgasm because I was too busy holding my stomach in for partners. I get it. It's a long journey, but it is a worthwhile journey to love your body. It is the only body you get. It is the vessel. It is where we live. And I can't tell you how many women will come to me and look at pictures of when they were younger and going, I hated my body then and looked how good it looked. And I'll say, yeah, and in 10 years, you're going to look at the pictures and say the same thing. How about you love it now?
Beautiful. I know that you say that embracing pleasure is a healing act. And I know that as we're moving through midlife, we're dealing with grief, with loss, not only of our former selves, but aging parents, we have changes in our relationships, life circumstances. We've spent so many years neglecting our own pleasure. What are the first steps we can take to really connect into this really healing and empowering source of reconnecting to pleasure, which is our birthright, isn't it?
Yeah, pleasure is not frivolous. And so many of us are like, oh, I'll do that later. We know that pleasure is a human right. In fact, the World Association of Sexual Health says sexual pleasure is a fundamental human right. And so realizing that pleasure is life affirming, whether it's a good laugh or a good orgasm or a massage. I have had so many women say to me, now that I'm empowered and having pleasure in the bedroom, it's like got ripple effects. I'm more confident outside of the bedroom. So how do you start? I would challenge all listeners to start small, do something every day that gives you pleasure. Maybe it's just sniffing some lavender. Maybe it's taking a walk in the woods. Maybe it's masturbating. Work up to the idea that pleasure is part of your daily routine, just like brushing your teeth is.
Beautiful. I love that. And then that creates, I always say that pleasure builds pleasure. That builds our capacity to experience more pleasure in so many other aspects of our life, whether it's in the bedroom or out of the bedroom. I love that. Such a beautiful message. Laurie, thank you so much. I always like to finish my conversation by asking my guests, what does pleasure mean to you personally, Laurie?
It means embracing life. I want to embrace the tears and the joy, the laughter and the pain. I want to embrace all of life. Pleasure is a big part of it. So to me, pleasure is synonymous with embracing life.
Oh, thank you so much. That's such a beautiful way to end our conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Laurie Mintz, for being here. Again, thank you for your work, your fierce activism and advocacy for female pleasure. We need your voice in this space. So thank you so, so much.
Well, and thank you for all you do. And thanks for having me on. It was wonderful.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Pleasure in the Pause. Want to help me spread more pleasure in the world? Hit the share episode button and send it to a friend or post it on your Instagram stories and tag me, Gabriella Espinosa. And if you really love this podcast, please leave a rating or review, as this helps the show get in front of new listeners. Finally, if you would like to access even more pleasure and stay in touch, sign up for my free pleasure upgrade bundle of powerful mind-body practices by going to pleasureinthepause.com. Remember, your pleasure matters.